If you looked at the HAVN HS 420V GPU and thought to yourself, that looks like a nice case, but maybe a bit too massive for my desk or a bit complicated to build in, then there's good news because the HAVN BF 360 is here. Now this is an interesting case that takes a number of the good highlights of that larger HAVN case and crams them into a smaller form factor with some really interesting design choices and some nice specs as well. I'm not too ashamed to admit that I pronounced the brand name wrong the first time. It's not HAVN, it's HAVN, and in this video I'm going to show you how I crafted in this case in a couple of different ways with a 360mm radiator at top and also an air tower. I also want to talk to you about the various highlights of the case, like this bottom channeling down here, which allows the case to suck air from those massive 180mm fans at the front to cool the GPU and the CPU effectively. I'll show you later in the video the thermal performance of these two different setups and talk about the quirks of it as we go through. But you'll see with this version of the case, it comes with two 180mm fans at the front and one 140mm fan at the rear. These fans are also interestingly designed with teeth blades, as you can see, these serrated edges on them, designed to support airflow. Now, I mentioned the fact that it comes with these large fans as standard. There are two versions of the case, one with and one without fans. I found this a bit quirky because in the reviewer's guide, it talked about taking these front fans off and replacing them with other versions of the fans, and indeed the brand sent me a bunch of fans to be able to show you what was possible. And the manual for the case shows similar, but I wanted to point out that it's not possible to change the fans on the front of the case if you pick the flow variant. These 180mm fans cannot be replaced. You can take them off, but the bracketing there then won't allow you to add in extra fans. But then who's going to want to change these for 120 or 140mm anyway? That would be an odd thing to do because these are obviously designed for maximum airflow. Just look how big they are compared to a 120mm fan. Pretty nuts. One obvious downside to this is that the front fans are black and you can't get white versions of them, and this might annoy some people, but HAVN says that it won't matter because they're behind the front panel anyway, so you're probably not likely to see them too much, but you can make your own judgment call there. The case also has other interesting highlights to it, including an anti-sag bracket for your GPU, that interesting rubber setup for the cable management, and a number of other things of interest as well, like the fact that you can pop the top off so this tray comes out, and this can obviously support a number of different things. You can put, for example, three 120mm fans on there, like the H12 fans, which are white, so you can match the case with them, or you can get black versions of these fans as an alternative. And as you can see, that looks pretty nice with those set up as exhaust on the top. Or you can use two 140mm fans, which sadly you can only fit on one side, which I think looks a bit odd with that gap there, but you can't fit a third one in, so there's just this eyesore of a gap. But in terms of airflow, it probably makes sense because it'll be right above the CPU cooler at least. So that's something, and larger fans obviously support better airflow. And then the other option is two large 180mm fans on top, which again would have to be black. The brand recommends installing them like this as well, with one fan facing down and one fan facing up. So you've got more intake coming in from the top and then an exhaust out of the top as well. Now this is obviously the setup that I used with the air tower that I'll show you in a little while, and it's one option, or alternatively you can put a 360mm radiator on there from an all-in-one cooler, which we'll get to in a little while. But if you're popping in an air tower, this makes a lot of sense because then you've got front intake and then airflow coming through from the top, and then air going straight through the cooler. Found another good use for that removable top panel as well when I was struggling to get the power cables in because of the air tower cooler. So the CPU power cables on the left hand side just wouldn't plug in because there wasn't enough space there. So you can pop that top off and then plug your cables in, and there's less hassle. Now I mentioned that all the panels are screwed in place, so it's worth noting little screws for removing everything. So we take the rear panel off, and then you can see a number of the other highlights from the previous case are also present here. We have a PWM fan repeater, so that's already set up with all the fans, and this thing will need powering. So obviously in the bundle of front panel connectors, you'll find that there are various things in here, usual sort of USB-A, USB-C connections, but also a fan power connector and a SATA power connector. So you'll need SATA power for that fan repeater. So essentially, the fans are already wired, the two front fans and that rear fan are already wired into that. you just plug the power in, and then you plug the connection into the motherboard, and then that's set up so that it'll run nicely. And you can just add in extra fans to it and plug it into a chassis fan header or system fan header to have control over the speed and things as well. So pretty straightforward there, and nice addition. It's the little details like this which make these HAVN cases stand out, because you'll see there are a number of other things here. We have channels at the back for running the power cables through and your other cables, and the management of things as well. I'm not the best at cable management, as you'll see, but there's plenty of space here for managing these cables with the Velcro ties and the areas where you can just put the cables in really easily, nestle them away and get things nice and neat at the back, and then take advantage of the ports to run the cables through to the front, which I will admit are a little bit fiddly, as I'll show you in a second, but it's great to have this space and a well thought out space as well. Sadly, you will notice as we go through that this case only supports standard motherboards, not rear connect motherboards, which is a shame in 2025, but this does mean that you can make the most of this rear area and the cable channel areas so that you can put all the cables neatly in the front and then hide the shame at the back. You'll notice at the front we also have these rubber areas where you can run the cables through. Now this was neat on the HS420 vGPU because it meant that you can nestle the cables away there and then use the various different clips to sort of tighten them up to make them nice and tidy. Now I find this a bit fiddly. It's a bit fiddly to get your things through there and to keep them neat, and it's a bit of a hassle, but it is worth doing because you can end up making it look a lot nicer, I think. So it is nice. It is a good design choice. It's pretty interesting. It's just very fiddly. I'm clumsy. I'm not great at this sort of thing. And what I found was these kept coming off. Now in the accessories kit, you'll find that there are extra clips included in here. So you can see we've got a number of different clips for the different areas, longer and shorter ones. Now I took one of them off, one of these rubber areas off, so that I could show you the clip mounting process and how it goes on there. I wouldn't recommend doing this though. Don't take them off because it makes it worse to put it back together again. But how it works is basically the clips notch onto the little areas in between. So each of the sort of runs, the clips goes through there and then notches onto the top and bottom, and then they can be slid along sideways to pinch the cables together. This is great in theory if you've got reasonably easy cables to manage, like thin, flat 24-pin power cable that I've got here from Corsair's RM Shift power supply unit, but it's not so good if you had a fatter one, for example. And what I did find was it was a little bit fiddly depending on where you ran the cables through from. So you can see me trying to plug in the SATA data cables here on the side, and you'll notice that it's pushing those rubber areas over and it doesn't look very neat. What I found is there's little clips at the top and the bottom on the rear here, which if you put back together, so you put the mount back into that, that often straightens those out. So if you buy the case, there's a little tip for managing that. You'll see these in multiple points around the case though, so it makes cable management pretty easy if you're good at it. The other thing you'll see is we also have the anti-sag bracket for the graphics card, which in theory is excellent. So this is a 5070, which is a fairly compact card and quite short, but the anti-sag bracket can be adjusted. So it can be shifted up once you've loosened it and then maneuvered around side to side and turned. So you'll see there's a couple of screws in here for loosening it and adjusting it. I did find, however, that it got in the way of the SATA cables, which I then had to unplug, move out of the way, maneuver the thing around and then plug those back in. So you have to think about the order of things if you're using SSDs, for example. But you can see you can push it up and then you can adjust it and put it in a position where in theory it shouldn't be a problem and should support the graphics card. This is good because it means that you can account for different sizes of graphics card. As I said, this 5070 is fairly compact, so it's nice it still reaches it with relative ease, and then you can push it up into the bottom of that and support it. However, one thing I found was after I'd built the case, somehow this slipped, and I noticed that when I was testing, the GPU was running a lot hotter than normal, so it was running like 75 degrees when it would normally be 70. I thought this was odd. What I discovered was the mount had accidentally turned and was blocking the bottom fan and therefore causing the GPU to run hotter than normal. So watch out for that. That was very much a user error though, not a design problem with the case, but just my mistake. Somehow it got knocked, so it turned and then it just blocked the fan blades, and that was the issue. But I got it sorted out, and you'll see the thermal performance with proper testing later on. I mentioned that the case doesn't support rear connect motherboards, but what it does do is it supports ATX, eATX, micro ATX, and mini ITX. Now, naturally, ATX is the most logical motherboard choice and the easiest one to install because it would just sit right over the standoffs that are pre-installed there, so you can just pop that in. And as you've seen, nice air tower is also possible. At the rear, you'll find there are mounting brackets for storage as well. So you can pop them off. Now, they're interesting because they're layered. So there's a top little one and then there's a bigger one behind it. So you can use these to install SSDs and then hard disk drives, depending on what you want to put in there. The options are limited depending on what you're intending to install. So if you want to install a hard disk drive, you have to use that back plate which sits closest to the case. You mount your hard disk drive to it, screw it into the back in a few different points, make sure that it's facing the right way, and then this will just sit back into the case. And then obviously the bracket that sat on top of it beforehand is no longer usable, but this would slot into there. So if you're using hard disk drives, it's one in here and then one in the one below potentially, so you could have 2 hard disk drives in there. The difference is if you want to use SSDs, things are slightly different because that smaller bracket that comes off the front of that can hold 2 SSDs. So you can mount an SSD on either side of this, which means that potentially you can have 4 SSDs in the back of the case. So it's either 2 hard disk drives or 1 hard disk drive and 2 SSDs, or 4 SSDs total, which is a pretty decent amount of storage. Nowhere near as much as the HAVN HS 420 vGPU, but it's still a nice amount. And also these are positioned in a good place where you can easily mount them. The mounting process is very straightforward. They're easily mounted here, and they have rubber mounting points on them as well for anti-vibration purposes. And then you can run your data cables and power cables quite neatly through the edges and to the bottom with relative ease here as well. Now let's get into some thermal testing. First I'm going to start with the air tower setup that I use, and the specs of the build will be in the description so you can find out more for yourself. I'm using a Thermalright Peerless Assassin for this, and the first thing I did was run a Cinebench test on it with the Ryzen 7 9800X 3D. What I found was I got a fairly decent score of 1210 on here, which isn't the best score I've got, but isn't terrible. And also the temperatures were decent as well, so you can see the core temperatures got up to a maximum of 80 degrees, where the average temperatures were lower than that. Note this because we do get a better score with it all-in-one cooler in a minute. Then I wanted to test a number of different games with it. Now I did notice that the CPU temperatures in this setup were actually a little bit hotter than I'd normally expect to see with this CPU, as I've tested in other builds. So I found it was in the low 70 degrees mark, often around there, when usually it would be 65 or lower in other builds that I've created using the same CPU. So I found the air tower wasn't cooling as effectively as I'd like. However, despite that, it wasn't very noisy during the testing. Also, what I noticed is the GPU was running cooler than usual, so the graphics card usually gets around 70 degrees C in these games at 4K when I've played it in other builds that I've done. So I actually found that the GPU was getting nicely cooled by those large front fans, which is great. So this is positive news for the airflow of those front fans and the graphics card, despite there not being airflow fans right below the GPU, as you've seen with other builds. So it speaks volumes to that curved design at the bottom as well. Obviously, you're seeing a number of different games here, and you can see the thermal results in the top left, so you get an idea of what it was like while I was playing. But you'll see the CPU, as I mentioned, a little bit toasty than I like. So what I decided to do was to swap over to a Kraken Elite cooler instead. Now, with mounting a 360mm all-in-one cooler, you have a couple of options. Obviously, you could put the tubes on the left, but then they'd be touching that rear fan, which I think wouldn't be ideal, really. So what I ended up doing was putting them on the right-hand side instead. There's a good amount of space here, and with the removable top, installation of a radiator is fairly straightforward as well. But what I did do is I took the standard fans that are included with the Kraken cooler and swapped them for the triple pack of the H12 fans, so that they kind of match the aesthetic of the rest of the build. This is fairly easy to do because these H12 fans are daisy chainable, so the connectors from each of them go into a single extension cable, which you can see here, that I then just connected to the CPU fan header and then set it up like this. And during the testing here, I started again with Cinebench, and I found that I got a better score here. So we got a better score. We got up to 1288, which is the best score I've got with this Ryzen CPU. And the temperatures, although looked a little bit hotter in some areas, we're looking at 79 degrees C, the core temperatures. The averages were lower. And what I found is this definitely worked. So the performance was better here across a variety of different games. Now the CPU temperature is down to more of what I'd expect it to be, somewhere in the mid 60 degrees C mark. And this is similar to what I've seen in other tests. Also, doing this hasn't had a massive negative impact on the performance of the graphics card. So although the previous build had that large 180mm intake fan at the top of the case, it's not massively negatively impacted the GPU, so we're actually finding GPU temperatures still good as well. Now, there were times when the CPU still did get a little bit hotter, but generally speaking, it seems that the all-in-one cooler was the better for this test. Now, it's worth noting I did have some issues with one of the systems crashing, so I had to change the motherboard, which is obviously not ideal for the testing and something to bear in mind. And your experience may vary as well, environmental factors and other things, depends on what air tower you're using. But this was my experience. It was better with the all-in-one cooler. The setup was more effective and cooler. Both these setups did run quietly during my gaming sessions though, whether with the all-in-one cooler or with the air tower. I found that the cooling performance was good and quiet and didn't interfere with my game. So I was obviously playing with headphones, but I didn't find it was so loud that it was obnoxiously noticeable while doing so. That's the advantage of having the large fans and the good airflow in the case. Just means that you can get on with gaming without being interfered with by a constant noise from fans, which is definitely a benefit of the design. So it's a pretty nice case to craft in, and a good looking one by the end. Not as nice as the HS420 vGPU, I don't think. It's not as flexible, it's not as aesthetically pleasing, but it does have a number of nice highlights to it, as you've seen. Now, with that in mind, there are some weird design choices. For example, the dust filter for the power supply unit is at the rear, so you'd have to get to the back of it to pull that out, which will be a hassle when you need to clean that. And some of the quirks, like the rear panel has to go on at an angle, so when you go to take it off, just be careful with that. You have to sort of pull it outwards and then lift it up, because otherwise it won't come out properly, and it could be easy to bend that if you're not careful. Now the front panel just clips into place, and that has a dust filtering on the inside of it that you can see, but that can't be taken off separately, so you have to remove that. As you see, it's got this slate finish to it, which is quite nice looking though and unusual. The top panel also has dust filtering on it and a little tag that you can use to pull it off. But this is also screwed in place, so that slots into place and then is held down at the rear with two little screws there. So that's good because you won't lift it up accidentally and pull that panel off, assuming you've secured it in place properly. And then the glass panel also slots in and screws in. But just one quick note here, if you've screwed it back in like this, the plastic peel will be very disappointing because it gets caught on the edge. So if you try and do it like I did at the end of the video, you'll find it gets caught on the bottom and then ruins your shot or just your satisfaction from pulling that out. Minor points though. Otherwise, a pretty nice case and a good looking one. I like that slate front, for example. And some interesting highlights to it, like the airflow and the addition of the anti-sag bracket and the PWM repeater. Stick around now to hear a sound test without me talking so you can hear what the fans sound like. This has been the Provoked Prawn. Thanks for watching. You've made it right to the end of the video, you brilliant legend you. If you've enjoyed it, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and drop me a comment down below if you've got any questions. If you really enjoyed it, consider joining the channel and see the benefits of doing so. Check out these other videos, you might well find them interesting or useful, and most importantly, have a great life.